Good evening.
So explain this completely counterintuitive notion to me. You're saying the Taliban is almost cheering at the death of Osama Bin Laden.
They have to be very careful not to do this out publicly, but certainly many in the Taliban movement, including people in the leadership, privately say good riddance. As far as they're concerned, Bin Laden is the one who led to the toppling of their government. They gambled and lost their government because of this man.
Explain that to those of us who have not been as steeped in Afghan politics as you. Take us back through the history of what the relationship was between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and what led to the toppling of the Taliban government.
The Taliban movement took over the government in Afghanistan by capturing the capital in Kabul in 1996. When they got there, they inherited Bin Laden. He'd already arrived. The Taliban had they'd got their own business, which was to try and capture Afghanistan and try and put an end to the civil war there. Osama managed to wheedle his way into the confidence of the leadership there, and in 1998, while in Afghanistan, he of course declared war on the Crusaders, meaning the United States. After he launched the attacks on the East African embassies, of course, he goes to the top of the US wanted list, and the sole demand that the US had of the Taliban movement was to hand him over. It was the refusal of the Taliban leader, Mullah Umar, to hand over Bin Laden, which meant that Bin Laden was able to carry on with the plotting of the 9/11 attacks, and then, of course, led to the US intervention in Afghanistan to topple the Taliban government, precisely because they'd failed to hand over the culprit behind both the East African embassy attacks and 9/11.
So what I hear you saying then, just to kind of reduce this to the Cliff Notes version of your history there, which was fascinating, if the Taliban had basically said to Osama bin Laden, take your fight somewhere else, either had not let him in the mid-90s, not embraced him in 98, or simply had turned him over in 2001, then we would not have gone into Afghanistan. The Taliban would have stayed there, and their fight with us is something that was ancillary to their overarching objectives.
That's a conclusion which I have heard many senior Taliban reach, and even now, as they sort of sit more or less in hiding and discuss what happened, how do we get ourselves into this predicament, many of them have concluded that their own leadership called it wrong back in 2001 by trying to protect Bin Laden, or sort of guessing that the US wasn't serious, failing to hand him over. The Taliban themselves have concluded we got it wrong, we gambled, we lost, and we gave up our government for the sake of this man.
So what does that mean prospectively? What does that mean either from their perspective? What do you think, some of them certainly, what do you think they might want to do now? And I know you have to parse it more finely. There is no singular they. There are different factions there. And what do you think that suggests for what we, the United States, should do in terms of reaching out to them?
Well, a lot of the Taliban sort of think that now with Bin Laden off the scene, this removes one obstacle to the possibility of some kind of agreement between them and the US has been intervening in their country. It's one difficult point off the agenda. However, it's going to have to be the US and the international community that takes the lead and actually probes it. As far as the US is concerned, the US has been caught up in two struggles here. There's one which is the fight against terrorism, going after Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, international terrorist networks, and there's also been another struggle, which of course is that to try and stabilize Afghanistan. The fight against Al-Qaeda, no doubt it will carry on for some years, but it's a different effort trying to stabilize Afghanistan. And as the US tries to find a way responsibly to draw down its troops in the country, to be able basically to get the army home, or as much of it as possible, they have to find some way of stabilizing it. And the most obvious way, if it works, is to get the Taliban on board, basically to get the Taliban leadership to call an end to their operation.